In 1540, a merchant ship arrived at Greenland's eastern shore looking for Viking settlements that had thrived there for 5 centuries. What they found was disturbing. Abandoned farms, empty churches, and complete silence. 5,000 Norse colonists had simply vanished. No mass graves, no signs of battle, no evidence of a desperate evacuation. Just empty buildings with belongings still inside, as if people had stepped out for a moment and never returned. For centuries, this disappearance has haunted historians. The Vikings had survived in Greenland longer than European colonies lasted in North America. They'd built churches, traded with Europe, and raised livestock in one of Earth's harshest environments. These weren't helpless settlers, they were descendants of the most successful seafarers in medieval history. So, what killed them? Climate change? Starvation? Disease? War? The answer is more disturbing than any single catastrophe, because the Vikings sealed their own fate through a series of choices that seem baffling until you understand the psychology behind them. This is the story of how pride, stubbornness, and cultural identity destroyed an entire civilization. To understand how the colony died, we first need to understand how it survived for so long, because that's the part that makes no sense. Greenland is a terrible place to farm. Even the name is misleading. Eric the Red allegedly called it Greenland in 985 CE as a marketing tactic to attract settlers. The reality, it's over 80% covered in ice. The growing season is brutally short. Trees are nearly non-existent. Winter temperatures can drop below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet somehow, the Vikings made it work. At its peak around 1200 CE, the Norse Greenland population reached approximately 5,000 people living in two main settlements, the eastern settlement near the southern tip and the smaller western settlement further north. They built around 600 farms, 16 churches, a cathedral, and even a monastery. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent stone structures designed to last generations. They survived by combining old-world farming with careful adaptation. They raised sheep, goats, and cattle. They hunted seals for meat and oil. They collected bird eggs from cliffs. They even maintained trade with Europe, exporting walrus ivory and polar bear pelts in exchange for iron, timber, and luxury goods they couldn't produce locally. Archaeological evidence shows they were doing relatively well for centuries. Skeletal remains from the early period show adequate nutrition. Trade goods from Europe appear consistently in the archaeological record. Church tithes were paid to Norway and Rome. These people weren't barely hanging on. They'd built a functioning society in the Arctic. But there's something strange in the archaeological record that historians didn't notice for decades. Something the Vikings weren't doing that should have saved them. The Inuit people, indigenous hunters who'd migrated to Greenland around 1200 CE, were thriving in the same environment that would eventually kill the Vikings. They lived in similar regions, faced identical climate challenges, and yet they prospered while the Norse starved. Why? What did the Inuit know that the Vikings refused to learn? The answer lies in something archaeologists discovered while examining Viking garbage heaps. Animal bones tell stories. When you excavate medieval refuse piles, you can reconstruct what people ate by analyzing which bones appear and in what quantities. And when researchers examined Norse middens, trash heaps, from different time periods, they found something shocking. In the early centuries, seal bones appeared frequently. The Vikings were hunting marine mammals, which made sense given Greenland's environment. But as time progressed, seal bones became increasingly rare. By the final century of Norse occupation, they'd almost completely disappeared from the diet. What replaced them? Cattle bones. Even as conditions worsened, even as starvation loomed, the Vikings were slaughtering their livestock rather than hunting the abundant seals that could have sustained them. Meanwhile, Inuit refuse heaps from the same period are overflowing with seal bones. The Inuit had perfected seal hunting techniques, using kayaks and specialized harpoons. Seals were renewable, nutritious, and available year-round. A single seal provided meat, fat for lamps, skins for clothing, and bones for tools. The Vikings knew seals existed. They'd hunted them before. They could see the Inuit successfully hunting them. So why did they stop? The answer gets at something deeply psychological. The Norse Greenlanders weren't just European colonists. They identified as European farmers. Their entire cultural identity was built around livestock herding and dairy production. That's what civilized Norse people did. That's what separated them from savages. Hunting seals like the Inuit meant adopting indigenous technology, kayaks instead of boats, harpoons instead of nets, Inuit hunting techniques instead of Norse methods. It meant looking, acting, and living like the people they considered primitive. And they refused. This refusal extended to almost every survival strategy that could have saved them. Archaeological evidence shows the Vikings had limited contact with the Inuit despite living in close proximity for over 2 centuries. Only a handful of Norse artifacts have been found at Inuit sites and vice versa. This wasn't due due to hostility. There's minimal evidence of violence between the groups. It was due to cultural segregation. The Norse simply didn't want to engage with people they viewed as inferior. But the Inuit weren't primitive. They were perfectly adapted to Arctic survival. Their technology was sophisticated and specialized: bone needles for sewing waterproof clothing, toggle harpoons that wouldn't pull free from prey, sled designs optimized for ice travel, knowledge of animal behavior passed down through generations. The Vikings could have learned these techniques. They could have traded for Inuit technology. They could have intermarried and combined Norse organizational skills with Inuit survival knowledge, creating something new that drew from both cultures. They chose not to. Instead, they clung to European farming methods that were increasingly failing. They maintained cattle herds that required massive amounts of hay that became harder to grow as temperatures dropped during the Little Ice Age. They cut down what few trees existed for fuel and building materials, never replanting until Greenland became even more barren than it naturally was. DNA analysis of cattle bones from late-period Norse sites reveals something heartbreaking. The cows were becoming progressively smaller and weaker over generations, showing signs of severe malnutrition. The Vikings were breeding malnourished cattle to produce more malnourished cattle rather than abandoning the practice entirely. Why pour so much effort into failing livestock? Because in medieval Norse culture, land ownership and cattle ownership were markers of status. A man with cows was a landowner, a person of standing. A man who hunted seals was just a hunter, low status, possibly not even fully civilized by Norse standards. They were literally starving to death to maintain their class identity. But cultural stubbornness alone doesn't explain the total collapse. Something else was happening, something that turned a crisis into extinction. Climate change was ravaging Greenland during this period. The medieval warm period that had made Norse settlement possible was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Temperatures dropped. Sea ice expanded, making navigation more dangerous and isolating Greenland from European trade routes. Growing seasons shortened even further. These climate shifts were devastating, but not necessarily fatal. The Inuit survived them. Other Arctic populations adapted. The Norse could have adjusted if they'd been willing to change. Instead, they doubled down on the very practices that were failing. Skeletal remains from the final period of Norse occupation tell a grim story. Analysis shows severe malnutrition, stunted growth, and increased infant mortality. Teeth show signs of repeated nutritional stress during childhood. Bodies were getting smaller, weaker, less capable of surviving harsh winters. Yet even during this final period, archaeological evidence shows they were still maintaining cattle, still trying to farm, still refusing to fully embrace seal hunting despite its obvious advantages. Church records show they continued paying tithes to Rome well into the 14th century, sacrificing scarce resources to maintain religious connections with a Europe that had largely forgotten about them. Trade with Europe became sporadic, then rare, then stopped. Ships from Norway came less frequently, partly due to dangerous ice conditions, partly due to dwindling profits. Walrus ivory, the Vikings' main export, was losing value as elephant ivory from Africa became more available in European markets. The economic foundation of the colony was crumbling. And then there's the mystery of the Western settlement's abandonment. Around 1350, the smaller northern colony was suddenly deserted. When officials from the eastern settlement sailed north to investigate, they found farms abandoned with livestock still wandering the fields. No bodies, no explanations. The people had simply left or died, and we still don't know exactly what happened. The eastern settlement held on longer, but the end was inevitable. The last documented contact with Norse Greenland comes from 1408, a church wedding recorded in Icelandic annals. After that, silence. When European ships returned in the 1500s, they found ruins. Theories about the final years range from gradual abandonment to catastrophic collapse. Maybe the last survivors died from disease. Maybe they were absorbed into Inuit populations, though genetic evidence doesn't strongly support this. Maybe a few managed to board ships and escape to Iceland or Europe, leaving no records. Each harsh winter killed the weakest. Young people might have left when opportunities arose. Families might have abandoned farms as conditions worsened, consolidating into smaller communities until the population reached a tipping point where maintaining the infrastructure became impossible. The tragedy is that it didn't have to end this way. The Norse Greenlanders had opportunities to adapt. They could have adopted Inuit survival techniques. They could have abandoned cattle farming for seal hunting. They could have built kayaks instead of maintaining boats designed for European waters. They could have intermarried with the Inuit, creating a hybrid culture that combined strengths from both peoples. But every one of these survival strategies required abandoning their identity as European Norse Christians. And that psychological barrier proved insurmountable. Recent archaeological work has revealed even more heartbreaking details. Researchers found that in the final decades, the Vikings were eating their hunting dogs, animals that could have helped helped them hunt. They were consuming seaweed and lichens. They were doing everything except the one thing that would have worked, learning from their Inuit neighbors. The collapse of Norse Greenland isn't really a story about climate change, though climate played a role. It's not about isolation, though isolation made things harder. It's about the deadly consequences of cultural inflexibility in a changing world. The Vikings who settled Greenland were tough, resourceful, and capable. They'd crossed the North Atlantic in open boats. They'd built a functioning society in the Arctic. They had the intelligence and skills to adapt. What they lacked was the willingness to change their identity. This isn't ancient history with no relevance to today. We're watching similar patterns unfold now. Industries collapsing because they refuse to adapt to new technologies. Communities dying because they won't embrace economic change. People clinging to identities and traditions even when those traditions no longer serve them. The Norse Greenlanders teach us that survival isn't just about resources or climate or luck. It's about psychological flexibility. The willingness to say, what we've always done isn't working anymore, so we need to become something different. That's terrifying. Changing your identity feels like death. The Norse would rather have actually died than stop being Norse farmers and become Arctic hunters. And many of them did die, choosing cultural purity over survival. The empty farms and silent churches of medieval Greenland stand as monuments to that choice. Somewhere in those ruins in the archaeological record is a moment when the last Viking looked around at the failing farms and the thriving Inuit villages and still chose tradition over adaptation. That decision cost them everything. Not because they were stupid or weak, but because they were human. And humans will often die for identity before they'll live with change. The question we should be asking ourselves is, what are we refusing to adapt to right now? What traditions are we maintaining past their usefulness? What survival strategies are we rejecting because they don't fit our image of who we are? The Norse Greenlanders can't answer anymore, but their empty settlements are still asking the question.